back to another video on this channel. If you're new here, hey, hi, my name is Lillian and I like to talk about books. This video is going to be the second part of my October reading wrap-up. The first part I posted a couple days ago and goes over the 11 graphic novels that I read this month. I will link that video in the cards, I think on this side of the screen. But I split my reading wrap-up into two videos this month just because I wanted to give adequate time to all of the books that I read this month and also not leave you with an hour-long video. Let's start off with the two books that I ended up DNFing this month, the first of those being 7 Gothic Tales by Dickinson. I think I knew within the first page or so of this book that we were not going to get along. I read about 10 pages of the first tale and about 2 pages of the second tale and realized my suspicions were correct and just DNF'd it. I just found Dickinson's writing to be incredibly stiff and antiquated and not in a way that I enjoy. I just found it to be very dry, very boring, and I wasn't willing to drag myself through an entire book of it, so I DNF'd. The second DNF was a bit of a surprise for me, and that was The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfeld. This is a book that I had been looking forward to reading for several years now. It's been on my shelf for several years. I decided to finally get to it, and I got about halfway through. I really wanted to like The 13th Tale, and I'd heard many good things, and on the surface there were several aspects of this book that I thought that I would enjoy. We have two main characters, one of them being raised essentially in a bookstore, who grew up reading Victorian literature, who's an amateur biographer. She prefers books to people. And the second main character is a mysterious and reclusive famous female author who is finally willing to start telling her life story. I'd originally picked up this book when I had heard that there were some strong Gothic vibes to it, and there are definitely parallels to Gothic classics such as Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. In the end, it was just the execution and delivery that fell very flat for me with this book. There were some definite sections of beautiful prose in this book, but I found that they were mixed in with parts that I just found to be utterly tedious. Something that I found to be very odd and off-putting with this book is when Vida Winter is recounting her life story to Margaret, she tells it in the third person, which just felt very odd, very jarring, and a little bit out of place. There were also other points in this book where I could see Diane Setterfeld's proverbial author fingers in the story. She was purposefully crafting certain things, and as a result for me as a reader, I could never fully suspend disbelief. I could never fully immerse myself in this story. I got about 200 pages in and realized that I was just dragging with this book and didn't want to drag any further. The rest of the books that I'm going to talk about in this video, I will talk about them in ranking of how much I enjoyed them, starting with the books that I enjoyed the least and working up to the books that I enjoyed the most this month. The book that is at the bottom of this pile is Vampire Hunter D by Hideyuki Kikuchi. This was originally published in 1983 and it is translated from the Japanese by Kevin Leahy. I originally picked up this book after having watched the 2 Vampire Hunter D movies. The first one, Vampire Hunter D, came out in 1985, and the second one, Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust, came out in 2000. I will tell you right off the bat that I really did not enjoy this book, and this is going to be a little bit of a rant review. The story itself is set in 12,090 AD in a post-nuclear holocaust where vampires and other mythological creatures are a reality. Our main character D is what is known as a dhampir. He is half vampire, half human, and he is a mercenary who wanders the land looking for commissions for hunting and killing vampires. The idea of this world is very interesting to me, however, the execution of the world building was just very weak. It didn't feel cohesive, and there were just pages and pages and pages of info dumping. The way that this world is set up is with the idea that vampires and these other mythological creatures existed pre-nuclear holocaust, and after nuclear obliteration, they decided to come out of the shadows and finally instill their rule over the world. Personally, I think it would be way more believable if you had these mythological creatures be mutants as a result of a nuclear holocaust, but that might just be me. The pacing for this book also just felt like it was all over the place and was very stop-start. Hello there, it is the next day. I had a little bit of a technical snafu when I was recording yesterday, and so this is take 2 of recording. Let's get back to trashing Vampire Hunter D because honestly, it deserves it. My biggest issue with this book was the constant and overt misogyny. The two notable female characters in this story, for whatever reason, are hopelessly in love with the male protagonist, Dee. He's described as being incredibly beautiful and that everyone instantly loves him and he's such an honorable man. But his main traits seem to be that he's, one, invincible and often a Mary Sue, and two, he's incredibly stoic and doesn't show any emotion. So clearly he's a catch. The first encounter we have with, I would say, the main female character in this book, she gets into an argument with Dee and decides to strip naked in order to distract him. Any girl in this book that is above the age of maybe 12 is described as having beautiful, bountiful curves and very kissable lips. The female characters in this book are just incredibly misogynistically flat, and they are constantly falling over themselves in order to defer to Dee's opinion. Really, they just exist to be sexual objects in this story, as well as just plot points for the narrative. This book came out in 1983, and as of 2020, there are 53 volumes of it, none of the rest of which I will touch with a 10-foot pole. The next book didn't make me nearly as angry as Vampire Hunter D, but it wasn't one that I would say that I really enjoyed. I was rather bored by it, if I'm completely honest, and that is Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. Emily St. John Mandel wrote Station 11, which I read several years ago and absolutely adored. It is a story that still haunts the back of my brain from time to time. Unfortunately, this was just a bit of a disappointment. Sea of Tranquility features topics such as time travel, worldwide pandemics, past, present, and future timelines interweaving with themselves, and the discovery of a glitch in the timeline that is under investigation. It starts out with the various perspectives of people throughout points in history who experience the glitch in the timeline, and then we finally come to the person that will be the main character. His name is Gaspari. He was born and raised on a human-made colony on the moon in the future, and as an adult he goes to work at the Time Institute on the moon colony and is sent to investigate this glitch in the timeline. There is a very meta character in this book. One of the characters that experiences the time glitch is a female author from Earth who writes a best-selling novel about the outbreak of pandemic, and ironically she is on tour for said book when another pandemic breaks out on Earth, which just felt like a very meta nod to Emily St. John Mandel's experience having written Station 11. Overall, unfortunately, this book just felt very flat for me. I was really immersed in the characters and the writing of Station 11, but did not have the same experience with this book. The writing and the characters honestly felt very detached, and it was really hard to care about the plot or the characters. If I'm honest, most of the characters, including the main character Gaspari, really didn't feel like they were fleshed out at all, aside from the female author character who wrote the pandemic novel. This might sound a little harsh, but to me this book felt like the author was thinking of topics that held a lot of weight, a lot of the potential to be thought-provoking, to be these big sort of like revelatory topics, and she just sort of threw them all into one book but didn't really do anything with them. They were just there and they were supposed to speak for themselves. Overall, I was just rather underwhelmed with this book, unfortunately. I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. Next, I will talk about the audiobook of Anne of Avonlea by L.M. Montgomery that I listened to this past month and I did quite enjoy. The Anne of Green Gables series is just one that I find to be very atmospheric, very autumnal, and I really have enjoyed listening to both books respectively in autumn. This is the second installment in the series where Anne is now 17 and is taking on the role of schoolmistress in her town of Avonlea. Like the previous book, it is very episodic, it's very whimsical, it's very much Anne getting into adventures and missteps and scrapes and finding ways to get herself out of them. This book and this series were originally published in the 1910s, which is something that I like to keep in mind for context when reading these books, just because there are featured some outdated notions of gender, of class, of race, of child rearing that I personally, and I think most people today, do not subscribe to. That being said, I still enjoyed the reading experience of this book, and it was very lighthearted and fluffy and what I needed at the time. I gave this book and the first book in the Anne of Green Gables series 3 stars out of 5. Next up is a book that I don't know if I can fully say that I read in the month of October, as I've been reading it for the past 3 years. I finally pushed through and finished the last third of this book in October, and that is the selected poems of Emily Dickinson. This collection groups a number of Emily Dickinson's poems into 4 different topics or categories. We have life, nature, love, and time and eternity being the final category. There were definitely poems in here that I really did enjoy, and there were certain sections or topics that I really enjoyed reading her poems from, namely the nature section. For me, there were definitely pros and cons to having them grouped in the way that they were. A pro being that having the poems grouped thematically, you could do a lot of comparison and analysis based on that grouping of poems. However, if there was a topic or a string of poems that I was just not jiving with, it was sort of hard to slog through poem after poem in the same topic or genre. The last section, Time and Eternity, was one that I struggled to get through, and why it took me about 3 years to finally finish this book. That being said, I really did admire the majority of the poems in this book. I really enjoyed finally getting to experience Emily Dickinson's poetry. The version that I read is a Modern Library Classics edition, and there is an introduction by Billy Collins, and there's an afterword by, I believe, another poetry scholar. But I really did appreciate the before and after in this edition, because both of them were able to give a lot of context to Emily Dickinson and her poetry, and suggestions of how to approach it and how to read it. The introduction mentioned how Dickinson was writing in somewhat of a vacuum during her time due to her hermit-like existence, and as a result, a lot of the potential context that we might have been able to gain from, say, more of her writings, her letters, her interactions with others, has been lost to time. And so when you read Dickinson, you sort of have to contend with that aspect of mystery and obscurity in her subject matter for some of her poems, which is sort of part of the experience of reading her. I found her voice and her style to be very unique to anything else that I have ever experienced with poetry, and I really overall did enjoy the collection. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. The other poetry collection that I read this past month is If Not Winter, Fragments of Sappho, translated by Anne Carson. This was definitely an experience to read, and I'm very glad that I had that experience. I have a lot of respect and admiration for Anne Carson and her translation of this work. Sappho is one of the earliest female poets that we have record of and fragments of her writing. She was a Greek poet that lived on the island of Lesbos, and a lot of her poems deal with her experience of being in love with women. Her poetry and where she is from is where the term lesbian comes from. But as a result of it being written over 2,000 years ago and it being written on papyrus, a lot of that unfortunately has been lost to time. We only have 1 full poem of hers that remains, and the rest are fragments, which is something that Anne Carson definitely touches on in the introduction to this collection. What she's done to indicate where fragments have likely gone missing, or there are literal holes in the papyrus that she is translating, is to have brackets next to words that are just left empty. So on one page you will have the ancient Greek, and then on the other side you'll have the English translation, and the brackets are there to indicate where bits are missing. Like I said, reading this collection was definitely an experience. For me, it was a very powerful experience nonetheless. There is so much that is missing, and what remains often feels like an echo of what was. Reading this feels like picking through the shadows of the past and trying to figure out what might have been, what was. There are some fragments in here that are literally just a single word or maybe 2 words on a page, and that's all that is left. As a result, you are left to wonder about what it used to be part of. As someone who loves history, part of the magic of reading documents like this, reading writings from hundreds or thousands of years ago, is getting to see parts of humanity that still ring true for our current experience. It's the realization that a writer from over 2,000 years ago is documenting the experience of having an emotion that I myself have felt very strongly, and the ability to look into the past and realize that humans really are not that different. Sappho definitely has me waxing poetic over here, but the experience of reading this collection was a very powerful one for me. It's one that I will definitely be revisiting in the future. I'll leave you with one of my favorite fragments from this collection. I want to say something, but shame prevents me. Yet, if you had a desire for good or beautiful things, and your tongue were not concocting some evil to say, shame would not hold down your eyes, but rather you would speak about what is just. Has anyone else been victimized by Tamsin Muir? If so, please raise your hand. I am definitely still processing this book, still recovering from this book. If you read the Locked Tomb series, you will know that you really do not know what the heck is happening in any of the books until the very end, and all the pieces fall into place, and then your mind is completely blown. This is definitely going to be a reread for me when the audiobook comes out. I had a similar experience when the second book, Harrow the Ninth, came out, and I was left in shock and was processing. Upon rereading Harrow the Ninth, I absolutely fell in love with that book and definitely see the mastery behind it. I'm hoping I have a similar experience with Nona the Ninth. It's hard to review this book without giving away any spoilers, but I will do my best. I will say the child narrator perspective of this book did take me a little bit to get used to. I did end up enjoying it in the end, and I think I will likely enjoy it more on the second read through. I'll just say it, I adore Camilla Hecht so much. It was really fun to see her and some of the other previous characters in this series in a new light and getting to see them interact with each other. This book is still very funny, but it was less heavy on the meme humor and more on the circumstantial, the narrator is a child humor. Again, I am still processing, still recovering. Looking forward to the audiobook coming out because I really do enjoy the narrator that does the audiobooks for this series. And yeah, I think that is where I will have to leave that. Woof. Next up, let's talk about Blackfish City by Sam Miller. This was a book that I read at the very beginning of this month, and it sort of led me to read the next book that I will talk about after this. This is a book that I knew a little cursory information about, but overall ended up going in blind, and I really enjoyed the experience of that. This book is a speculative future dystopia set in the 22nd century in the aftermath of the ravages of the climate crisis that in some ways are still going on. It takes place on a man-made city that is floating in the Arctic and is comprised of refugees from any number of nations around the world. In this speculative future, the majority of nation states that we know have all fallen due to climate crisis, due to political infighting, due to lack of resources, and the city where this book takes place is one of the last enclaves of humanity. The story itself is told from multiple perspectives and follows four people who all exist on the outskirts or on the periphery of society for one or another reason. The catalyst for this book is the arrival of a stranger to this city who is riding an orca and has a polar bear following her. This definitely causes a stir within the city itself and eventually leads to the overlap of all four of the perspectives that take place in this book. The story and the characters within it operate within a city that is struggling with large amounts of corruption, with crime syndicates, with huge wealth disparities between different classes, alongside an outbreak of a new disease called the breaks. Sam Miller does a really nice job of making sure that each of the characters that he is writing from has a very distinct narrative voice. There is some lovely queer and non-binary representation in this book, which was nice to see. I definitely enjoyed the characters in this book, but one of the main things that has stuck with me after having read it is the world in which it was set. The casual world building that Sam Miller does in this book is really just haunting. He does a really great job of showing and not telling with this world and building slowly the context for how the world eventually got to this place. I think the thing that is so haunting for me about this book is, though it is a speculative future, it is built on a lot of the crises that we as a society and we as a world are currently facing. And yeah, I just thought that the world building was so well done. It is one that has definitely stuck with me and has given me a lot to chew on. Supposedly all of Sam Miller's books are set within the same world, so I will definitely be picking up more of his books when I get the chance. I think I gave this 4.5 or 4.75 stars out of 5. This was really good. Highly recommend this one. And last but not least, we have my favorite book that I read this month that was definitely inspired by and is in the same vein as Blackfish City, and that is The High House by Jessie Greengrass. This was easily my favorite book this month. It is a very intimate, troubling look at the repercussions of the climate crisis and what can survive in the wreckage. This is set in the near future where the climate crisis has become more and more prevalent, it's becoming clearer and clearer that the crisis has reached a turning point, and it's become clear that there will very likely be a large loss of human life as a result. And yet the governments in this book are still twiddling their thumbs, which feels very familiar. The story is told in a series of flashbacks from three of the characters, Polly, Caro, and Sally, who have all arrived at the High House, which is a former summer house that has been stocked with various supplies and means of survival. The flashbacks weave together an understanding of how these characters managed to get to the High House, the early days of their survival, the characters' ability to reflect on and compare the world before all of this happened and the world after, as well as reflections on their arguably very bleak future, being cut off from the rest of the world, really having no means of contact with whatever remains of the outside world. Something that I really ended up enjoying with this book was the dynamic with the character Caro and her stepmother, who is a very prominent climate activist, as well as Sally and this climate activist. The sort of tensions and frictions between these two girls and this older climate activist, touching on concepts of parenthood in the face of ecological extinction. The writing in this book is absolutely gorgeous. I don't usually annotate my fiction books, but this one I broke out the highlighter and the pen and was just scribbling all over it. There's a quote from this book that I wanted to share with you that was within the first chapter of this book, and when I read it, I felt like I needed to sit down. This quote is from Caro's perspective. "It is so hard to remember now what it felt like to live in that space between two futures, fitting our whole lives into the gap between fear and certainty. But I think that perhaps it was most like those dreams in which one struggles to wake but can't, so that over and over one slips back against the mattress, lets the duvet fall, and shuts one's eyes. There is a kind of organic mercy grown deep inside us that makes it so much easier to care about small, close things, else how could we live? As I grew up, crisis slid from distant threat to imminent probability, and we tuned it out like static. We adjusted to each emergent normality and did what we had always done. The commutes and holidays, the big Friday shops, day trips to the countryside, afternoons in the park. We did these things not out of ignorance nor through thoughtlessness, but only because there seemed nothing else to do. And we did them as well because they were a kind of fine-grained incantation made in flesh and time. The unexalted, tedious familiarity of our daily lives would keep us safe, we thought, and even Francesca, who saw it all so clearly, even she who could not let herself be gulled by hope, stood by the open fridge at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and swore because there was nothing to give the baby for his tea." I don't know if this book really helped quell any of my climate crisis anxieties, but it did feel very cathartic to read. I've seen this book being described as post-apocalyptic, but for me this feels more very much like a haunted warning. The events that scientists have been telling us for years that will happen, and in many ways are already happening with this planet. Honestly, I want to throw this book at so many people in my life, and just in general, this was very easily a 5-star read for me. And that, my friends, is my October reading wrap-up. I will link to the first part of this wrap-up in the cards and in the description below. What were some of your favorite books that you read this past month? Tell me about them in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, you can give this video a thumbs up. That apparently helps. You can also subscribe if you want to see more videos from me and my existential dread about the climate crisis. I hope that you all are doing well, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye.